The sun was low, painting the fields with a fading glow. Paul walked slowly along the dirt path that cut through his farmland. His boots were worn from years of work, and his hands carried the calluses of endless harvests. The season had been hard. The ground was dry, the crops were thin, and every sack of grain felt heavier than the last. Yet Paul was a man who did not complain. He took life as it came, step by step, day by day. The village where Paul lived was small. Families knew each other's names, and the gossip of one home became known to all by nightfall. Life was simple, but full of worry. Food was scarce, tools often broke, and sickness spread easily. Still, the people managed with what they had. They trusted each other and shared when possible. Paul was quiet among them, a man of steady habits. He rose early, tended to his fields, and returned home with little more than bread, milk, and silence for company. That evening, as Paul moved along the edge of the woods, he noticed something strange. A shape lay among the tall grass. At first, he thought it might be a lost animal, perhaps a stray dog or a deer caught in the thorny weeds. But as he stepped closer, his heart began to beat faster. The shape was small, fragile, and trembling. It was not any animal he knew. It was a child, but not a child of earth. The skin of the being was pale with a faint blue tint, as if touched by the cold. The eyes were large, glowing faintly with silver light, even in the fading sun. Thin arms clutched at the stomach, and the chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Paul froze where he stood. His mind whispered danger, but another voice rose louder. It was the voice of his humanity, the same one that once urged him to feed stray dogs or mend broken nests for fallen birds. This child, whatever she was, looked helpless. Paul crouched slowly, keeping his hands open so the child would see he carried no weapon. The child's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the chest heaved in hunger. The child's ribs showed through the thin body. She was starving. Paul looked back toward the village. If anyone saw him, rumors would begin. Fear would spread. They might harm the child out of ignorance. He took a breath and made his choice. He reached forward and gently lifted the small figure in his arms. The body was light, far too light, as though she had not eaten for days. The head rested against his shoulder, and for the first time Paul heard a soft sound. It's like a sigh of relief. He carried her home. Paul's house stood at the far edge of the village, close to the fields he worked. The walls were simple wood, the roof patched with straw. It was not a large home, but it was warm and clean. He laid the child on his old bed, then hurried to the kitchen. His hands moved without thought. He lit the fire, filled a pot with water, and set it to boil. He cut what vegetables he had left, dropped them in, and added a pinch of salt. The smell of soup soon filled the small room. The child stirred at the sound of boiling water. She opened her eyes wide and silver, staring at the ceiling beams. When Paul approached with a bowl of steaming soup, she flinched and drew the thin blanket over her face. Paul spoke in a calm tone. "It is safe here. I will not hurt you." Of course, she could not understand his words, but perhaps his voice carried meaning. He placed the bowl on the table and waited. Slowly, a small hand reached out, trembling, and touched the wooden bowl. The child brought it close and sniffed. Hunger overcame fear. She began to drink it first carefully, then with growing need. The soup spilled, but she continued until the bowl was empty. A faint color returned to her face. She leaned back with a sound that could only mean comfort. Paul cleaned the spilled soup without a word. He watched her, noting every movement. She was not like anything he had ever seen. Her skin shone faintly under the firelight, and her hair was thin, almost like threads of silver. She wore a cloth that was torn and stained with dirt, nothing like the clothes of the villagers. Her small hands had long, narrow fingers. Her eyes never blinked for long moments. When she caught him watching, she tilted her head as if asking a question. Then she did something unexpected. She pointed at him and pressed a hand to her chest. A soft sound came from her lips, a word in her tongue. Then she pointed at him again. Paul understood. She was asking his name. "Paul," he said, pressing his own chest. She repeated, not perfectly, but close enough. "Paul." Then she tapped her chest again and spoke a word he could not repeat well. It was soft, flowing, like the sound of wind moving through leaves. Paul tried to say it, and she smiled for the first time, a small curve of lips that carried warmth. For a moment, the strangeness faded. She was just a child, far from home. Night fell. Paul lit a small lamp and sat by the window. He wondered what story lay behind this child. Was she lost? Was she sent here? Were there others like her nearby? His thoughts were heavy, but he knew one truth clearly. She was alive because he had chosen kindness. That choice could bring trouble. The village might not understand. They feared what they did not know. Still, Paul could not turn her away. As the hours passed, the child slept deeply, wrapped in a blanket. Paul listened to her breathing, steady and calm now. He thought of his own younger days when his mother used to tell him, "A man's worth is not in what he earns, but in what he gives." That memory gave him peace. But outside, in the still night, something moved. The woods seemed to whisper. Shadows stretched across the field longer than they should be. An owl cried, then fell silent. Paul looked out, but saw nothing more than the sway of trees. Still, unease touched his heart. He turned back to the sleeping child. She shifted, murmuring in her strange tongue. Paul placed another log on the fire, making sure warmth filled the room. Whatever might come tomorrow, tonight the child would rest in safety. By morning, word had already begun to spread. A neighbor passing by had seen Paul carry something unusual into his home. Questions stirred. Was it a beast? A sick traveler? Or something worse? Paul greeted them with calm words, but gave no answer. He knew the less they knew, the better for now. The child awoke with energy she had not shown the day before. She walked unsteadily around the room, touching the wooden walls and staring at the flicker of fire. She tried to speak, but the words meant nothing to Paul, yet her tone was gentle, as though she wished to thank him. He gave her bread with honey, and she smiled again. When she was finished, she walked to the door and looked outside. Her silver eyes grew distant. She seemed to be waiting, searching for something in the horizon. Paul noticed the look and wondered who she hoped to see. That evening, as the sun set once more, Paul felt a weight in the air. The child drew shapes in the dirt floor with her finger. One shape looked like a tall figure with glowing eyes. She pointed to it, then to herself. Paul did not understand fully, but he knew enough. She was not alone. Someone was coming. Paul looked to the darkening sky. He had given soup to a starving alien child. But what would come of it? He could not say. Only one thing was certain. The days ahead would test, not only his courage, but the courage of the whole village, and thus the encounter had begun. Morning light spilled over the village as smoke from cooking fires rose into the clear sky. Paul stepped out of his small house, stretching his arms after a long night of uneasy sleep. Inside, the alien child still rested on his bed, wrapped in the blanket. She looked calmer now, her face no longer pale with hunger. Paul felt relief, but with that relief came a heavier worry. The village was already stirring. Neighbors walked with baskets, children played in the dust, and old men sat outside sharing talk. Paul noticed more than one curious glance thrown toward his home. He knew word had spread. Villagers had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Someone had seen him carrying this strange child. And now questions buzzed like flies around meat. Paul carried water from the well, keeping his steps steady, not showing any unease. Yet inside he knew the truth. If the villagers discovered what lay under his roof, they might not show kindness. Fear was quick to grow when something strange appeared. When he returned, the child was awake. She sat on the floor, drawing shapes in the dirt with her long fingers. Her eyes lifted to meet his, bright and silver. She gave a small smile, then pointed at the fire where the pot still hung. Paul understood and set about making more soup. She ate slowly this time, savoring each spoonful, as though she trusted food would come again. After breakfast, she walked to the door and peered outside. The moment her gaze touched the woods, her body grew tense. She stood still for a long time, silent, staring into the distance. Paul followed her eyes, but saw nothing except the swaying trees and the long shadows. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She turned to him and drew a shape again on the dirt floor, the same tall figure with glowing eyes she had made the night before. She tapped it twice, then pressed her hand against her chest. Paul frowned. He did not know the meaning, but he understood enough. The figure mattered to her. It was not an idle drawing. That day Paul worked in the fields as usual. He could not ignore his farm, for without it he would have nothing to eat or trade. The child stayed close, following him between rows of dry stalks. She was light on her feet, almost soundless, though once or twice she stumbled, unused to the rough soil. Paul gave her a walking stick, and she accepted it with a curious look, as though testing the weight. The hours passed, and Paul felt something strange. The air carried a heaviness that was not normal. Birds flew quickly from the trees and did not return. His cows shifted uneasily in the barn, stamping their hooves and snorting at shadows. Even the dog, old and usually calm, barked once and then hid under the porch. At night, the unease grew worse. Paul sat by his window, staring into the dark. The moon hung bright, silvering the fields, but no crickets sang. No owls called. The night was too quiet. His skin prickled. He rose, stepping outside with a lantern. The light fell across the dirt yard. Nothing moved, yet he felt eyes upon him. The child appeared at the doorway, silent as ever. She looked toward the woods and whispered a sound, soft and flowing in her tongue. She clutched Paul's sleeve, pulling him back inside. Her face showed fear. Paul obeyed. He bolted the door and sat by the fire, his mind troubled. The next morning, trouble arrived in another form. A group of villagers stood at his fence, calling his name. Paul stepped outside, forcing calmness into his voice. Morning, he greeted. The men and women looked uneasy. One of them, an older man named Harris, spoke for the group. Paul, we have seen strange things. Your dog barks at nothing. Shadows move in the woods. And folks say they saw you carrying something to your house. What is it you hide? Paul kept his face steady. I brought in a sick traveler. Nothing more. She needed food and rest. Harris narrowed his eyes. A traveler. No one saw her arrive. She wears no clothes like ours. Children say she shines in the dark. What manner of guest is she? Murmurs rose among the group. Fear flickered in their eyes. Paul raised his voice slightly. She is only a child. Starving, weak. Would you turn away a child because she looks different? My mother taught me better. Some villagers lowered their heads, ashamed by his words. But not all. Harris pressed on. A child today, perhaps. But what comes tomorrow? Will her kin follow? Will they bring danger to us all? Paul's heart clenched. He had no answer, for he himself feared the same. Yet he could not betray the child. She is under my care, he said firmly. As long as she is weak, I will protect her. That is all you need know. The group left, but unease lingered in their eyes. Paul knew whispers would spread thicker now. That night, the signs grew stronger. Paul woke to the sound of silence. Not one insect moved, not one leaf stirred. He rose from his bed and found the child standing at the window, staring out with wide eyes. Her body shook. Paul followed her gaze. At the edge of the woods, a shadow moved. It was tall, too tall for any man. It glided between trees without a sound. The lantern light did not reach that far, but Paul felt its presence. His breath caught in his throat. The child raised her hand and pressed it against the glass, whispering again in her strange tongue. Then she turned to Paul, her silver eyes filled with both hope and fear. She pointed outside, then to herself. She pointed again, drawing the tall figure in the air with her finger. Paul understood. Whoever that figure was, it mattered deeply to her. Perhaps it was the one she had been waiting for. But why then did her small hands tremble? Days passed, each heavier than the last. Animals vanished from the village, taken in the night without trace. Chickens, goats, even a cow disappeared. No blood, no sound, only silence. Fear gripped the villagers. They began to whisper of spirits or hunters beyond human sight. Some spoke of leaving the valley altogether. Paul watched his neighbors grow restless, but his concern was sharper. He noticed the child spent long hours at the edge of his yard, eyes fixed on the woods. She would whisper to herself, low and sorrowful, as though calling to someone. She ate little now, no longer from hunger, but from unease. Paul feared the time of waiting was ending. One evening, as he carried firewood inside, she caught his hand suddenly. She pressed her finger to her lips, signaling silence. Then she pointed to the barn. Paul listened. At first he heard nothing. Then it came a faint rustle, though no wind blew. A soft thud. Something moved among the animals. Paul lit his lantern and walked slowly to the barn. The child followed close, silent as a shadow. Inside, the cows shifted nervously. Straw lay scattered, yet there was no intruder he could see. Only the smell of cold air lingered, sharper than the night itself. He turned to the child. But she was not looking at the animals. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner where darkness clung. She whispered one word in her tongue, the same word she had spoken many times when drawing the tall figure. Paul's skin went cold. He understood only this much. The one she called for was here, watching, testing. When dawn came, the village found another animal gone, taken without sound. Harris stormed to Paul's farm with more men, their faces drawn with fear. "This is your doing," Harris accused. "Since you brought that strange child, the village is no longer safe. Whatever stalks us, it comes for her. Give her up before we all pay the price." Paul stood firm. "She is innocent. Would you cast a child into the woods to die? That is no better than murder." "She is not our kind," Harris spat. "And whoever hunts us is not of this world. If you protect her, you invite death to us all." The crowd muttered agreement, though some hesitated, torn between fear and shame. Paul saw their doubt, but knew he could not convince them forever. Soon their fear might grow to great. That night, Paul sat by the fire with the child. She ate in silence, then placed her hand on his arm. Her silver eyes met his. She did not need words. Paul understood. She trusted him. Yet outside, in the silent woods, something vast moved closer. The signs were no longer whispers. They were warnings. The mother was coming. The third night after the signs began, silence wrapped the village like a heavy blanket. No wind stirred the trees. No birds cried in the dark. Even the dogs did not bark. It was the kind of silence that made men wake in their beds, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. Hearts pounding, though they did not know why, Paul sat by the fire, the child sleeping on the bed behind him. He had grown used to the stillness of the nights, but this one was different. The silence pressed into his ears and chest until he could hardly breathe. His hand rested on the wooden staff he kept near the door, though he knew it would do little against what might come. The child stirred in her sleep. She whispered the same words she had spoken many times before, the name of the tall figure with glowing eyes. Her face twisted with worry. Paul rose and touched her shoulder gently. She opened her eyes and looked at him with fear. Then she pointed toward the window. Paul followed her gaze. At the edge of the field, beyond the wooden fence, stood a shadow taller than any man. It did not walk. It glided, smooth as smoke. The lantern on the table flickered, and the firewood cracked sharply in the hearth. Paul's heart pounded. The figure moved closer. With each step, the silence deepened. Even the fire seemed to grow quieter. The cows in the barn shifted restlessly, their hooves striking the ground in panic. Paul stood frozen. The child gripped his arm tightly. Her silver eyes shone brighter in the dim light, reflecting the figure outside. The door shook suddenly. Not with force, but as though touched by something unseen. Paul held his staff, his hands trembling. The door did not break. Instead, the shadow slipped around the house, and then, without sound, the tall figure stood in the doorway. She entered without opening the door. One moment the doorway was empty, the next it was filled. The mother had come. Her form was slender yet tall, towering over Paul by a full head. Her skin gleamed pale in the firelight, smooth like polished stone. Her eyes glowed faint silver, brighter than her child's, and they did not blink. Her hair hung long and dark, flowing as if moved by a wind no one else could feel. She did not make a sound. Her steps across the floor left no creak of wood. Paul stood firm, though every part of him wanted to flee. He held his staff like a shield. The child rushed to her mother, clutching her arm, speaking quickly in her strange tongue. Her voice trembled, yet carried joy. She had waited so long for this moment. The mother did not respond at once. She lowered her eyes to Paul, studying him. Her face was calm, but her gaze carried weight. It was not the look of a stranger meeting another being. It was the look of a hunter judging prey. Paul tightened his grip on the staff, but did not move. His heart thundered in his chest. The child spoke again, pointing to Paul, then touching her chest, repeating the motion as if telling a story. The mother's eyes softened slightly, but only slightly. Without warning, she vanished. One moment she stood before him, the next she was gone. Paul spun around, searching the corners of the room. The fire flickered, shadows danced, but she was not there. Then he heard its outside, a faint cry. A villager! Paul rushed to the door. At the far edge of the village, Harris and 2 other men had taken it upon themselves to patrol. They carried torches and pitchforks, whispering about driving away whatever haunted them. They did not know what they faced. The mother appeared among them without sound. Harris froze, his torch shaking. The other 2 men raised their tools, shouting in fear. But before they could strike, she moved. Her steps were swift but silent, her motions too smooth for human eyes to follow. The torches fell to the ground. The shouting stopped. When Paul arrived, the 3 men were gone. Only the torches lay smoking in the dirt. The villagers who heard the cries gathered in fear, but they saw nothing. Only Paul and the child, standing at the edge of the field, knew the truth. The villagers whispered, terror spreading. Some called it a demon. Others spoke of death walking without sound. Fear began to rise like a flood. Paul returned home, his chest heavy. Inside, the mother waited again, standing by the fire as if she had never left. She had returned without a trace of movement. The child clung to her hand, speaking rapidly. The mother watched Paul with her glowing eyes, and this time she did something new. She reached forward and touched his shoulder with one long, graceful finger. Her skin was cold, colder than the night air. Paul did not flinch. He met her gaze. Something passed between them in understanding, though no words were spoken. She withdrew her hand slowly, then turned to her child. In the days that followed, the mother's presence hung over the village. She did not appear often, yet everyone felt her. Animals stopped making noise at night. Fires burned lower, as if afraid. Children whispered of silver eyes watching them from the trees. Villagers stopped visiting Paul's farm. They feared the tall figure who came and went without sound. They feared Paul, too, for protecting the child who had brought this being into their lives. Harris had not returned, and his absence deepened their dread. Paul, however, began to see more clearly. The mother did not strike him, though she had the power to. She watched him instead, testing him, measuring him. When he worked in the fields, she appeared at the edge, standing still like a statue, her glowing eyes fixed on him. When he brought food for the child, the mother stood nearby, silent and watchful. Each time, Paul felt the weight of her gaze, but he did not waver. He continued his work, continued his care for the child, continued his life as best he could. Fear remained, but so did resolve. The child grew stronger. Her steps became sure, her eyes brighter. She often stayed near Paul, helping with simple tasks in her own way. She smiled more, though always with a trace of sadness. She still drew the tall figure in the dirt, but now she stood between the drawing of her mother and Paul, as if binding them together. The mother watched this too. Her eyes narrowed, her head tilted slightly. She did not speak, but Paul understood she was questioning, perhaps even doubting. One evening, Paul sat by the fire again. The child leaned against him, half asleep. The mother stood in the corner, her shadow stretching across the walls. For the first time, Paul spoke aloud, though he knew she would not understand. "You are powerful. You could end us all. But I fed your child because she was hungry. That is all. If you mean us harm, then take me first. But if you see any worth in us, know this: we are not all ruled by fear." The room fell silent. The mother did not move. The fire crackled faintly. The child stirred and looked from one to the other, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The mother stepped forward. Again, she reached for Paul's shoulder. Her touch lingered longer this time. Then she drew back, and for the first time since her arrival, she bowed her head slightly. It was not much, but it was enough. Paul exhaled slowly. He did not know if it was respect, warning, or something else entirely. But he knew one thing with certainty: the mother was not finished. She was watching, waiting, testing. The arrival had shaken the village. But it was only the beginning. The silent mother had come, and now humanity itself stood under her gaze. The days after the mother's arrival changed the village forever. People no longer worked with ease in the fields. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the woods as though the shadows might swallow them. At night, not a sound came from the trees, but that silence was more frightening than any howl. Every family kept their doors locked, lamps burning low, waiting for dawn. Paul felt the change in the air each day. His neighbors no longer greeted him as before. Some looked at him with pity, others with fear, and a few with anger. They blamed him for what had come. Harris and the other two had vanished, and their absence was like a wound in the village. Some claimed demons had taken them, others said the tall figure had devoured them whole. No one knew the truth except Paul and the child, and even they did not fully understand. The child, however, grew stronger by the day. She followed Paul with steady steps, helping him gather wood, carrying small baskets, and even laughing softly when he showed her how to plant seeds in the soil. Her silver eyes still looked off into the woods, but her fear had eased. She trusted Paul, and that trust gave him strength. The mother remained silent, but she was never far. Sometimes she appeared at the edge of the fields, watching Paul with her glowing eyes. Other times she stood outside his home when night fell, her tall figure unmoving in the moonlight. She entered without sound, always at will, and left in the same way. She never harmed Paul, never spoke, yet her presence alone felt like a question. Paul began to realize the truth. She was testing him. Every action he made, every choice, every word he spoke before the child was being weighed. The mother was measuring humanity. Paul had been chosen as the one to stand before her judgment. One night, a scream broke the silence. It came from the center of the village. Paul rushed outside, the child closed behind him. Several villagers had gathered, their torches flickering in the dark. A man shouted that something had entered his barn and taken his sheep without leaving a sound. Others joined in, each claiming they had seen shadows move across their roofs or fields. Fear spread like fire in dry grass. Then the mother appeared. She did not come walking from the woods. She simply stood among them, tall and silent, her silver eyes glowing brighter than the torches. The villagers gasped. Some dropped their tools, others raised them with shaking hands. No one dared move. The mother looked at each face, her gaze heavy as stone. She passed by the villagers one by one, her steps so soft they made no sound on the dirt. Paul forced his way to the front, his heart pounding. He raised his hands. "Stop," he said firmly. "She has not come to destroy us," villagers murmured angrily. Harris's brother shouted, "She has taken our men, our animals. She will take us next. She must be driven out." The villagers raised their voices, fear rising. The mother tilted her head slightly as though studying their cries. Then, in a swift motion, she vanished from sight. Gasps filled the air. A moment later, she appeared behind the crowd, silent as death. She touched the shoulder of the shouting man with one long finger. He froze, unable to move, his torch falling to the ground. She did not harm him. The message was clear. She could strike if she wished. The child rushed forward, standing between the man and her mother. She spoke quickly in her flowing tongue, pointing at Paul and then to herself. The mother's eyes turned toward Paul once more. The fire of the torches flickered in her pale face. Paul stepped closer, though every instinct told him to run. "If you mean to test us," he said softly. Test me. Do not harm them. The mother held his gaze. Then, as sudden as she had appeared, she vanished again. The silence returned, heavy as stone. The villagers fell back, pale and trembling that night. No one slept in the village. The next morning, Paul returned to his fields. The child helped him plant beans in the soil, her small hands careful as she pressed seeds into the earth. The sun shone warm, but Paul felt no ease. He knew the mother had not gone. She was near watching at midday. His fear was proven right. The air grew colder, though the sun still shone. The dog barked once and fled under the porch. Then the mother appeared at the far end of the field. She walked slowly toward Paul, silent as always. The child dropped her seeds and ran to her mother, clinging to her hand. She spoke in her tongue, pointing to Paul and then to the earth where they had planted. The mother studied the soil, then lifted her eyes to Paul. Without a word, she extended her hand. In her palm lay something strange, a seed, but not like any Paul had seen. It glowed faintly, pulsing with silver light. She dropped it into the soil where Paul had been digging. Instantly, a green shoot burst from the earth, growing before his eyes into a tall stalk with shining leaves. The child clapped her hands in joy. Paul stared in wonder, but he also understood the meaning. This was another test. She was showing what her kind could do, and waiting to see how he would respond. Paul bent down and touched the shining plant. He nodded once. "It is life," he said simply, "and life is always welcome." The mother tilted her head, as if considering his words. Then she vanished again. That evening, Paul sat by the fire, deep in thought. The child slept nearby, her breathing steady. The glowing plant stood outside in the field, tall and bright, casting silver light over the land. Villagers had already seen it and whispered in fear. Some called it a curse, others a gift. None knew which to believe. Paul knew the mother was testing more than just him. She was testing the entire village. Would they face her with courage, or turn to anger and fear? The answer would decide not only their fate, but perhaps the fate of all humans. As the night deepened, Paul heard a faint sound outside. He rose and opened the door. The mother stood there, her eyes brighter than ever. She raised her hand and beckoned him. Without thinking, Paul followed. She led him into the woods, moving without sound, her figure gliding through the trees. Paul struggled to keep up, the branches snapping under his boots. They reached a clearing where the moonlight fell in a silver circle. The mother stopped and faced him. For the first time, she raised both hands and made a gesture. She pointed to herself, then to the sky, then to him. Paul did not understand the words, but the meaning grew clear in his mind. She was showing him that she came from the stars. She was asking what humans would do when faced with such power. Would they fight? Would they hide? Or would they choose another path? Paul stood firm. "We have no strength like yours," he said, "but we have kindness. That is our power." Mother's eyes glowed brighter, then dimmed slowly. She stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest, and for a long moment she held it there. Paul felt her cold touch and his heart pounding beneath it. Then she withdrew and vanished into the night. Paul stood alone in the clearing, his breath heavy. He knew this was not the end. The test was still unfolding back in the village. Whispers grew louder. Some demanded the child be given up. Others feared striking her might bring the mother's wrath. The glowing plant in Paul's field only deepened the divide. Some saw hope, others saw doom. Paul returned to his home and found the child waiting, her eyes wide with worry. She reached out to him, and he placed his hand on her shoulder. "It is not over," he said softly, "but I will stand with you." The fire crackled. The shadows deepened. And far beyond the trees, the mother watched, silent and patient, waiting for the final choice. Dawn arrived slowly over the village. The sky was painted in pale gold and soft pink, but no one celebrated the sun's return. The villagers moved quietly through the streets, wary of every sound and shadow. The glowing plant in Paul's field remained, its silver leaves swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Some whispered that it was a gift. Others whispered that it was a warning. Fear had not faded. It had only grown deeper. Paul stood near the field, the child at his side. Her silver eyes were wide, reflecting the plant's light. She had not left his side since the night in the clearing, and Paul understood why. She trusted him completely, and he felt the weight of that trust more heavily than ever. The air grew still. Paul's heart told him what he already knew. The mother was coming. She was coming for the final test. He could feel it in the way the wind had stopped, the way the birds had gone silent, and the way the shadows had thickened near the edge of the woods. By midday, a strange quiet had settled over the village. Paul could hear the soft clatter of tools from a distant farm, but it seemed distant and unreal. He looked toward the woods. At first there was nothing. Then, as if the sunlight itself had shifted, a shadow appeared. Taller than any man, moving without a sound, gliding over the grass, the mother had come. Paul did not move. The child clung to his arm, whispering in her soft, flowing tongue. She pointed to him, then to the glowing plant, then to the sky. He understood. This was the moment. This was the choice. The villagers had gathered quietly at the edges of the fields. They did not speak. They did not approach. They simply watched, as if drawn by the impossible presence before them. Some trembled. Some whispered prayers. None dared interfere. The mother approached Paul and the child. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever, silver light reflecting in the child's wide eyes. She did not speak, but her gestures carried weight. She raised one long, elegant hand toward Paul, then to the child, then toward the village. It was a test of the heart, not of strength. She had power to destroy, yet she paused. She wanted to see what humanity could offer, what choice they would make when faced with a being capable of ending them all. Paul stepped forward. He looked toward the villagers. Their fear was evident, yet he could see doubt in some of their faces. He knew they had the capacity for courage if they followed his example. He turned to the mother and spoke softly. "You came to test us. I cannot speak for all humans. But for this village, for this child, for all we hold dear, I will offer what we have. We have life, care, and kindness. We have hope. That is our choice. We do not fight you, yet we do not flee. We give what we can and ask only for peace." The mother's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, so close that Paul could feel the air move with her presence. The child pressed against his chest, her tiny hand resting over his heart. Paul felt her heartbeat, steady and small, and he knew that the trust between them had given him strength beyond any weapon. For long moments, the mother did nothing but watch. Her gaze swept over the villagers. She turned her head slowly, observing their faces, their posture, their fear, and their courage. Then, in a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for a shadow, she vanished. The villagers gasped. The wind stirred. The birds cautiously returned. Paul kept his hand on the child, holding her close. He felt her small fingers clutch his shirt tightly, and he whispered, "It is not over yet, but we have done what we could." From the woods came a soft rustle. The mother appeared again, but this time she carried something. Her tall form moved gracefully across the field, and Paul saw that in her arms was a bundle. She placed it on the ground before the child. The child knelt, eyes wide with wonder, and lifted the cloth carefully. Inside was a small glowing seed. It pulsed with soft silver light, brighter than the plant in the field. The child looked up at Paul, then at her mother. The mother raised her hand in a gentle gesture as if giving permission. She did not speak, but Paul understood the message. She had accepted his choice. She had seen the courage, the care, and the mercy that humans could offer. And in return, she gave them life. The villagers, watching from a distance, stepped closer, cautiously. Some still feared, but many were drawn forward by curiosity. They saw the glowing seed and the plant already in the field. Slowly, their fear gave way to understanding. Perhaps the human's choice, even in the face of danger, mattered more than power. Perhaps the silent, graceful mother had been searching for something beyond strength. Paul knelt beside the child. "This is a gift," he said softly, "a reminder that life is worth protecting. The child nodded, her silver eyes bright with joy. She placed her small hands on the glowing seed, as if promising to care for it. The mother stepped back. For the first time, she allowed herself a small tilt of her head, a gesture that could have been respect. She took the child's hand gently. They turned toward the woods. Paul watched as they moved together, silently, gracefully, gliding between the trees. At the edge of the forest, they paused. The mother lifted her hand once, then vanished into the light of the day, leaving only her child behind briefly before both disappeared completely. The village remained still. For long moments, no one spoke. Then Paul rose, holding the child's hand in his own. The glow from the field's plant and the seeds seemed to fill the air with warmth. Slowly, the villagers began to move toward them. Some looked in awe, some in fear, but all carried a sense that something extraordinary had happened. Harris's brother approached cautiously. "We saw something," he said softly. "It is gone now?" Paul nodded. "It is gone, but it left something behind. It left a choice, and it is ours to honor." The villagers looked at the plants, at the child, at Paul. Fear remained, but courage was growing. They understood now that humanity was not weak simply because they lacked power. They were strong in ways that could not be measured by weapons or size. They were strong in care, kindness, and hope. The child returned home with Paul, walking quietly beside him. She held the glowing seed carefully in her hands. Paul led her to a small patch of soil near his home and helped her plant it. Together, they worked the earth. The seed sank into the soil, and before their eyes a small shoot emerged, silver and bright. Paul knelt beside the child. "This is life," he said, "and life always grows when it is cared for." She looked up at him and smiled, the first full smile since he had found her. It was a smile of trust, hope, and gratitude. The villagers gathered around. Slowly, their fear softened. They understood that the strange events of the past days had tested them. They had learned that courage and care were more important than fear. They had learned that kindness could reach even beings from the stars. By evening, the village had returned to a quiet peace. The glowing plants in Paul's fields shone softly under the moonlight, a reminder of the choice made, the test passed. The child slept peacefully beside Paul. He sat by the fire, watching the light dance across the walls of his home. He thought of the mother, silent and powerful, and realized that she had not come to destroy. She had come to measure humanity, and in her own way she had shown them a gift. The gift was not just the seed or the plant. It was the knowledge that even in the face of fear, humanity could rise to meet the impossible with kindness and courage. Paul knew that the world beyond the village might never understand what had happened. Others might laugh, fear, or dismiss it. But the child, the mother, the glowing plant, saw these had proven one truth. Humanity was strong. Not because of weapons or numbers, but because of its heart. The child awoke briefly and looked at Paul. She placed her hand over his and turned toward the field. The glowing plant swayed gently in the breeze, casting silver light across the ground. Paul stood and followed her outside. Together, they watched the stars appear in the night sky. Above, the heavens were vast, full of light and mystery. Paul knew that the mother and her kind were out there, somewhere, watching, measuring, waiting. And somewhere in that vastness, humanity had made its mark. They had chosen hope. They had chosen life. And for the first time in days, Paul felt peace. The choice had been made, and it had been the right one. The night was quiet, but no longer frightening. The village had survived. The child had grown stronger. And humanity in a small corner of the world had proven that kindness could shine brighter than any fear.